The flickering lights of the abandoned factory hid a secret so deep, following it meant trading my quiet life for an impossible descent into the earth. I shouldn't have looked, because the moment I saw the underground chamber, the alarms began to scream, and I knew I was trapped with something far worse than corporate crime. The fluorescent lights of the warehouse district always hummed a tune of quiet desperation, but tonight the air felt different, heavy, like the moment before a massive storm breaks. I was parked 3 blocks away, nursing lukewarm coffee from a thermos that had seen better decades, watching the loading dock of Apex Logistics. That was my employer, or rather, the gilded cage I called work. My boss, Mr. Silas Thorne, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, was supposed to be overseeing a late shipment. That was the official story. I've been Thorne's logistics manager for 3 years. I know the schedules, the manifests, the petty theft ratios down to the penny. But lately, the manifests were garbage. High-value, untraceable freight moving in and out between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always under heavy escort, always registered as specialized industrial components. I'd tried asking his right-hand man, Marcus, about it. Marcus just patted my shoulder and said, "Stick to the paperwork, kid. Don't look where the money sleeps." Good advice, except the money sleep was starting to smell less like profit and more like trouble. Tonight was the night I finally broke protocol. I'd copied the security fob codes weeks ago during a clumsy inventory audit. I told my wife I was working overtime on the quarterly audit, a lie so smooth it scared me how easily it came out. I needed to see what was in those unmarked white vans they used for the overnight runs. Around 1:45 a.m., the first van, a heavy-duty panel job with tinted rear windows, idled up to the dock. It didn't have the usual Apex markings. It was pristine, anonymous. Thorne himself emerged from his black sedan, looking unnaturally alert. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. It was dark tactical gear that looked utterly out of place against the industrial grime. He conferred briefly with the 2 guards flanking the van, guards who looked less like security personnel and more like retired special forces. They were quiet, unnervingly still. Thorne opened the back of the van. I couldn't see the contents clearly, even with the high-powered binoculars I'd borrowed from my uncle's old hunting gear. It looked like they were loading heavy metal containers, bolted down with specialized clamps. Not components. These looked like something serious. The whole process took less than 15 minutes. Thorne sealed the back, gave a curt nod, and climbed into the driver's seat of the unmarked van himself. That's when my stomach did a slow, sickening flip. Thorne never drove the freight. He managed it. This was irregular in a way that screamed, "This isn't about shipping specialized components anymore." I waited 10 agonizing minutes after the van disappeared into the maze of industrial roads. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I knew if I called the police, I'd be signing my own career's death warrant, maybe worse. Whatever Thorne was involved in, it had the feel of something that could make people disappear. But the curiosity, the creeping dread that I was an unwitting cog in something monstrous, outweighed the fear. I started my own beat-up sedan, keeping my headlights off until I hit the main road, then following at a distance that felt both too close and miles too far. The van drove east, deeper into the forgotten industrial zones outside the city limits, the area everyone calls the dead zone because the zoning lapsed decades ago. It finally slowed near an abandoned, massive foundry, the Sterling Works. It had been condemned since the early 90s after that massive industrial accident. Nobody went near it. Perfect for secrets. The van pulled right up to the main steel loading door of the foundry. No flashing lights, no official sign-in. One of the guards got out, checked a small panel beside the door, and a low grinding noise echoed across the empty lots. The massive door slid open, just enough for the van to slip inside. I parked half a mile away, deep in a thicket of overgrown brush beside a drainage ditch. I grabbed my small, rugged backpack containing a flashlight, a backup battery, and a cheap voice recorder, and started hiking toward the foundry. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the walk through the rusted yard terrifyingly dark. Every metallic groan sounded like footsteps behind me. When I reached the outer wall of the main building, I found a maintenance access panel that hadn't been properly secured. It was probably supposed to be welded shut years ago. Using a pry bar I'd brought, again citing emergency maintenance checks to my wife, I managed to bend the rusted latch just enough to squeeze through. The air inside was thick with the smell of old oil, dust, and something acrid, like ozone mixed with stale machinery. I navigated by the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through broken upper windows, moving from shadow to shadow, trying to locate the loading bay where Thorn had entered. The silence inside the vast, cavernous building was deafening. Then I heard it, the muffled sound of heavy machinery running, not above, but below. I crept toward the massive loading door area. Through a gap between two stacked containers, I could see the van parked inside. Thorn and the two guards were gathered around the rear doors, but they weren't unloading industrial components. They were unloading equipment. Large, metallic boxes connected by thick cabling. Thorn pulled out a secure-looking tablet and tapped the screen. A section of the concrete floor, directly behind where the van was parked, began to depress with a low, hydraulic hiss. It wasn't just a door. It was a massive, perfectly engineered elevator platform. Beneath it, a shaft descended into absolute blackness, illuminated only by the faint, yellowish glow emanating from below. This wasn't a warehouse operation. This was a staging ground. Thorn stepped onto the platform with the cargo. The two guards followed, their faces grim and focused. The platform began its slow descent. I realized I had maybe 15 seconds before they vanished underground, taking the secret with them. Panic spurred me forward. I sprinted across the open floor, dodging piles of debris. I reached the edge of the shaft just as the platform was halfway down. The yellow light was stronger now, showing polished steel walls and complex ventilation shafts running down the sides of the descent area. I made a split-second decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. I had to see what was down there. I scrambled onto the edge of the descending platform, pressing my body flat against the cold metal wall, praying they wouldn't notice the slight shift in weight or the sound of my rapid breathing echoing in the shaft. The platform kept sinking, smoothly, silently, deeper and deeper into the earth, the air growing warmer, the hum of powerful, hidden machinery growing louder, until finally, with a soft clunk, we arrived at the bottom. I peered over the edge of the platform. What opened up before me was not a maintenance tunnel or a storage cellar. It was vast, brightly lit by harsh white lights and lined with banks of high-tech server racks humming with terrifying efficiency. There were security checkpoints, biometric scanners, and, in the distance, a long corridor flanked by heavy, blast-proof doors. This wasn't just illegal storage. This was a secure, subterranean facility, miles from civilization, hidden beneath a dead factory. And I was standing right there, clinging to the outside of the elevator with my boss, who was now stepping off onto the pristine floor, completely unaware that I was sharing his secret descent. I took one shaky breath, ready to see what true secrets Thorn kept buried here, when suddenly, Thorn stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't looking at the servers. He was looking directly at the empty space where I was supposed to be, his face draining of all color. He raised his hands slowly, not toward me, but toward a small, discreet, wall-mounted sensor I hadn't even registered was there, and spoke into a hidden comms piece clipped to his collar, his voice tight with icy realization. "We have an anomaly on Level 1 descent. Code Delta. Initiate immediate lockdown." Someone followed us. Thorn's whisper, amplified by the chilling acoustics of the underground chamber, hit me like a physical blow. Someone followed us. He didn't need to look at me. The automated system had already registered the unexpected mass on the platform. The white lights overhead immediately shifted to a pulsing, aggressive crimson. Sirens, high-pitched and deafening, ripped through the engineered silence of the base. My heart hammered so hard, I thought it might tear itself free from my chest. I was trapped. The elevator platform, sensing the lockdown, had already begun its slow, deliberate ascent, leaving me exposed, clinging to the smooth metal siding about 10 feet above the ground level. The two guards, who had clearly been trained for every contingency except this bizarre scenario, reacted instantly. One fumbled for the device on his belt, likely an emergency override for the elevator, while the other scanned the cavern, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the slight movement of my discarded backpack, which had tumbled from the platform when I'd pressed against the wall. "There," the guard barked, pointing. I had milliseconds. Retreating was impossible. The elevator was going up, taking the only exit with it. Moving forward meant confronting Thorn and his muscle in a brightly lit, sterile environment designed for containment. I chose the only option that involved movement. I pulled myself up, swung my legs over the lip of the descending elevator car, and dropped heavily onto the polished concrete floor of the underground base. The impact jarred every bone in my body, and I winced, fighting the urge to cry out. I landed perhaps 20 feet from Thorn, who was now standing rigid, his tactical veneer completely stripped away, replaced by pure, murderous fury. "You," he hissed, his voice vibrating with disbelief and rage. "You actually followed me, David, after everything I gave you?" The guards moved in tandem, flanking him, cutting off any escape route toward the main server banks. I scrambled backward, kicking over a metal utility cart in a desperate attempt to buy a second. The cart clattered loudly, adding to the cacophony of the alarms. "What is this place, Silas?" I managed to shout, my voice cracking. My mind was racing, trying to process the scale of the operation, the servers, the reinforced doors, the specialized air filtration systems visible near the ceiling. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This felt like something lifted straight from a Cold War thriller. Thorn scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "What it is doesn't concern you. What you did concerns me. You just compromised 3 years of highly sensitive preparations." The guard closest to me suddenly pulled a small, dark device from his tactical vest. It wasn't a firearm, but something that looked menacingly high-tech, a short-range incapacitation weapon. Before he could aim, the second guard, the one who'd been focused on the rising elevator, shouted, "Sir, the lockdown protocol sealed the primary access route. We're contained down here until security override is initiated." Thorn didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were fixed on me, calculating. Containment is secondary now. Silence him. The guard with the incapacitation device aimed it directly at my chest. I knew I couldn't dodge it effectively in this open space. Thinking frantically, I spotted the metal utility cart I'd just overturned. It was heavy, solid steel. I hurled myself sideways, rolling toward it just as the device fired. There was a sharp snap, not a bang, and a searing heat washed over my left side. I felt a paralyzing jolt, like grabbing a live wire, but I managed to throw myself behind the overturned cart just as the electrical surge hit the steel. The cart absorbed the worst of it, sparking violently and overloading, the small internal battery dying with a faint pop. I lay there, trembling, my entire left arm numb, the scent of burnt plastic filling my nostrils. The guards hesitated, thrown off balance by the unexpected resistance and the failure of their non-lethal weapon against the improvised shield. "He's using cover. Full non-lethal suppression," Thorn commanded, backing away slightly toward the central control console, presumably where the override codes were kept. The second guard drew a different weapon, a specialized stun baton, crackling menacingly. He advanced cautiously. I knew I had only one chance. I had memorized the layout of the loading bay floor moments before the elevator descended. The area directly beneath the elevator shaft, where the machinery had retracted, was structural weak point, designed to open and close, not to bear heavy weight during an active alarm. As the guard lunged, swinging the baton in a wide arc, I pushed off with my good arm, using the momentum to roll under the edge of the elevator platform, just as it reached the ceiling, locking into place. I was now back in the shaft, sandwiched between the descending elevator car and the bottom of the ceiling housing. It was incredibly tight, suffocatingly dark now that the platform had sealed the opening above me, plunging me into pitch blackness, save for the beam of my small flashlight. The guards were confused. They rushed to the edge, looking down the shaft where the elevator car had just been. "Where is he?" the guard with the baton yelled into the shaft. Thorn, peering down over the edge, was furious. "He's in the shaft housing. Get him out." but the lockdown was effective. The maintenance panels around the elevator were sealed flush with the wall. They couldn't easily pry them open without specialized tools, and they couldn't just climb in after me without risking injury in the tight mechanism. I began climbing upward in the dark, using the cables and guide rails as handholds, moving vertically through the narrow space between the shaft wall and the elevator housing. I was ascending toward the main warehouse floor, where the only way out was the loading dock door, which was surely sealed by now. The sound of the guards trying to force open the lower access panels echoed below me, frantic, desperate hammering. I was moving upward fast, fueled by pure adrenaline. I reached the top, my shoulder scraping painfully against the ceiling mechanism. I could feel the floor of the main warehouse just inches above my head. I braced my feet against the opposite wall of the shaft, counted to 3, and kicked outward with all my remaining strength against the elevator car housing. The force was just enough to jar the sensitive upper locking mechanism of the elevator's ceiling seal. With a screech of tearing metal and a spray of sparks, the sealed ceiling panel popped open, revealing the vast, dusty darkness of the abandoned Sterling Works warehouse floor above me. I scrambled out, coughing from the dust, and rolled onto the concrete, clutching my throbbing left arm. The warehouse was empty now. The loading dock door was sealed shut, its massive lock glowing red under the emergency lights. I was trapped in the sealed, silent, massive building above the secret underground base. But I had a momentary advantage. They thought I was still trapped down below. I didn't waste a second. I ran toward the far side of the building, away from the elevator shaft, searching for any other exit. I rounded a towering stack of rusted barrels, my flashlight beam dancing wildly, when I skidded to a halt. Standing directly between me and a secondary, smaller personnel door, my only hope, was Silas Thorne. He hadn't descended with me, clearly. He'd had the necessary access codes to override the lockdown on the main floor and had sprinted to intercept any escapee. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear anymore. He'd stripped down to a black undershirt, revealing scars I hadn't noticed before, and in his hand he held something long, dark, and undeniably lethal. "End of the line, David," he breathed, aiming the weapon directly at my face. "You shouldn't have been curious." The muzzle of the weapon Thorne held was too precise, too steady for a man who had just been caught operating a massive secret installation. It wasn't the clumsy, illegal firearm I'd imagined. It was sleek, modern, and utterly terrifying. He looked like a different man entirely, the polite, slightly nervous boss replaced by a predator. "Silas, please," I tried, raising my good hand slowly, putting as much space between the weapon and my body as possible. My mind was screaming at me to look for an angle, a weakness, anything, but my body was locked by the sheer proximity of real danger. "I don't want trouble. I just want to walk away. I never saw anything." Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed mockingly in the vast, empty warehouse space. "Walk away? David, you've seen the access logs. You know the frequency of the subterranean transport. You've been breathing the air down there. You think a severance package is going to cover the risk you now represent?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes cold. "This isn't about money anymore. This is about national security, or at least what we call national security these days. You're a loose end, and I hate loose ends." As he spoke, I noticed something crucial. He was standing near the edge of the section where the elevator platform had retracted. The floor here, although seemingly solid concrete, looked slightly different. The aggregate was lighter, the lines subtly misaligned from the massive pressure of the descending door. It was an engineered seam, one that my climbing efforts might have subtly destabilized. The guards below, realizing I had escaped the shaft, were still trapped, desperately trying to override the system. I could hear muffled shouts echoing up the shaft opening, increasing the pressure on Thorne to finish this quickly before they managed to force the panels open from below and create a bigger distraction. "Think about your wife, David," Thorne pressed, taking a deliberate step closer, forcing me back toward the center of the room, away from the safety of the shadows I'd used to climb out. "She thinks you're auditing quarterly reports. How long until she calls the police? If you make this quick, maybe she just gets a phone call about a tragic workplace accident." That was the trigger. The thought of my wife Maya being drawn into this nightmare shattered the last vestiges of my rational self-preservation. I didn't care about running anymore. I cared about stopping him from controlling the narrative of my disappearance. I lunged, not toward the personnel door, but sideways, directly at the seam in the floor beneath the elevator housing, screaming as I put all my weight onto my single good leg and drove my shoulder into the concrete where the seam was weakest. The reaction was immediate and violent. The floor didn't just crack, it buckled downward with a deafening shriek of stressed metal and concrete dust erupting into the air. Thorn, taken completely by surprise by the direction of my attack, stumbled backward, trying to regain his balance on the crumbling surface. He lost his footing. His weapon clattered away across the floor, sliding uselessly under a stack of old machinery. Thorn roared in frustration, grabbing desperately for the edge of the collapsing section. He missed the edge and fell straight down. It wasn't the deep, engineered elevator shaft. It was a secondary drop chute, a short, steep slide meant perhaps for emergency waste or rapid equipment disposal, judging by the tangle of debris and discarded piping visible in the dim emergency lighting that flickered on briefly in the chute. He slid down with a sickening sound of scraping metal and muffled impact noises, vanishing completely. I stood, panting, at the edge of the sudden gaping hole, covered in dust, the silence returning, save for the faint, desperate shouts from the lower levels. I had neutralized my immediate threat, but now I had a new, infinitely more complicated problem. I was standing over a massive hole that led directly into the heart of their subterranean operation, and the alarms were still blaring. I snatched the sleek, unfamiliar weapon Thorn had dropped. It felt heavy, cold, and dangerous in my hand. I looked down the chute. I couldn't hear Thorn anymore, just the echo of the sirens and the metallic grind of the guards trying to break out from below. If they got out, I was finished. I aimed my flashlight down the shaft. It illuminated a short, steep drop, ending about 30 feet down in a pile of industrial junk. I had to follow. I had to secure the base, or at least find a way to broadcast what I had found before they silenced me permanently. I lowered myself carefully into the chute, finding purchase on the jagged edges of the collapsed concrete. It was a tight squeeze, and my injured arm screamed in protest. But I slid down until my feet touched solid ground amidst discarded piping and splintered wood. I was now standing in the bottom of the disposal chute, facing a low, reinforced access hatch, a maintenance door clearly designed to open into the underground facility, bypassing the main elevator. It was small, perhaps just big enough for one person to squeeze through. I checked the weapon in my hand. It seemed to have an integrated scanner or targeting system. A faint green crosshair appeared on the access hatch door when I held it steady. I brought the butt of the weapon down hard on the manual release wheel of the hatch, turning it violently. It groaned open reluctantly. I squeezed through the opening, flashlight beam cutting through the sterile white light of the secret base. I was in a narrow service corridor, running parallel to the main hangar where Thorn had disappeared. The alarms were still shrieking, but now I could hear new sounds, heavy boot falls echoing from the hangar, moving fast. The guards from below must have finally managed to force a panel open somewhere else, or perhaps Thorn had an emergency manual override for the main floor team. I flattened myself against the wall of the service corridor, my breath hitched high in my throat. The corridor ended 50 feet ahead, opening directly into the vast, brightly lit main operations room, the area I'd glimpsed from the elevator. Suddenly, the wall opposite me, a solid, seamless expanse of pressurized metal, began to glow faintly under the emergency lights. A section of the wall, about 8 feet wide, started to hiss, the pressure equalizing. It wasn't a door opening. It was a section of wall dissolving or retracting into the ceiling mechanism. Through the widening gap, I saw them. 3 figures in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets, moving with practiced, terrifying efficiency. They weren't Thorn's security detail. These looked like professionals. And they weren't looking for Thorn. They were moving directly toward the central server bank, scanning the area with infrared optics. And then I saw what they were protecting. Behind the server banks, bathed in the stark white light, was a containment unit, a thick reinforced glass chamber, and inside that chamber, illuminated like a specimen under a microscope, was a figure. A person, slumped against the glass, seemingly unconscious, strapped into a chair. As the tactical team marched past my hiding spot, one of them paused, scanning the service corridor with a handheld thermal imager. The green crosshair from Thorne's weapon in my hand suddenly went dark, the batteries finally dying from the earlier stress. The thermal imager swept over my position. The lead operative stopped dead, his weapon immediately locking onto the spot where I was pressed against the wall. "Contact! Service corridor B4, he barked into his helmet mic, raising his weapon. "Subject is unarmed but contained near central server access. Deploying containment foam." The lead operative didn't wait for confirmation. A small nozzle deployed from the end of his weapon, and a high-pressure stream of thick, rapidly expanding gray foam shot out, instantly engulfing the wall where I was hiding. The foam was designed to neutralize and immobilize, hardening like instant concrete in seconds. I reacted on instinct, yanking myself sideways and throwing myself out of the path of the foam cloud, simultaneously squeezing the trigger of Thorne's weapon. Since the battery was dead, it did nothing but click uselessly. The tactical team reacted to the inert click as if it were a live threat. They weren't deterred by the failure of my weapon. They simply increased their aggression. "He's trying to fight. Secure target. Non-lethal deployment only," the leader yelled, stepping forward now, leaving the protective arc of the server banks. I was now in the open, caught between the ceiling foam behind me and the advancing, highly trained operatives in front of me. The service corridor was a dead end leading back to the disposal chute, and the main hangar offered no real cover. My only option was the containment chamber itself. I sprinted toward the containment unit, a desperate, illogical charge. The tactical team, trained to anticipate movement toward cover or escape routes, seemed momentarily stunned by my suicidal trajectory toward the most heavily secured area of the entire facility. I reached the reinforced glass of the containment unit just as the second operative managed to secure a clear firing line on me. I didn't look at the figure strapped inside. I slammed my shoulder against the thick glass, trying to see if it was anchored or just resting against the wall. The tactical team member fired his canister. Not foam this time, but some kind of high-velocity impact round designed to disorient. It struck the metal frame inches from my head with a sharp thwack, sending vibrations through the structure. "Stop! Do not compromise the subject," the leader roared, a genuine note of panic entering his voice for the first time. This was the key. The figure inside the glass chamber was more important than me. I scrambled along the exterior of the chamber, looking for any external control panel, anything that indicated how this massive glass cage was operated. There was a small, recessed interface near the floor, shielded by heavy metal casing. It was clearly designed to be accessible only by authorized personnel, likely requiring a keycard and a retinal scan. But the chaos had given me a few more precious seconds. The team hesitated, unwilling to risk damaging the chamber or its occupant. I yanked the now useless weapon from my hand and used its hard metallic edge to pry at the seam of the casing protecting the interface. The metal groaned under the force, but held firm. My injured arm was screaming, but the pain was a distant buzzing now. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the alarms and the shouts, a sound of heavy, hydraulic grinding coming from the main elevator shaft, far above us. The guards below were breaking through. The tactical leader snapped orders into his comms. "Internal breach imminent. Secure the containment field. Use Level 3 protocol immediately." Level 3 protocol. I didn't know what that meant, but the way the leader said it suggested something final. As the metal casing around the control panel finally buckled under my frantic prying, revealing glowing circuits beneath, the containment chamber itself began to change. A low, powerful electromagnetic field hummed to life around the glass. Inside, the figure strapped into the chair stirred slightly. The leader of the tactical team abandoned his attempts to stop me non-lethally and drew a sidearm, a real kinetic weapon this time. He braced himself against the server rack and leveled it at my back. "Last warning, civilian. Step away from the panel." I ignored him, jamming the sharp edge of the dead weapon deep into the exposed circuitry of the panel, aiming for the main power conduit. Sparks erupted, not just small ones, but a blinding blue-white discharge that momentarily overwhelmed the sterile white lighting of the base. The containment field surrounding the chamber failed instantly. The humming stopped. The figure inside the glass chamber slumped forward, then snapped its head up, eyes wide and eerily focused. The tactical operative fired. I felt a sharp, searing impact in my shoulder blade. Not a bullet, but something that felt like being hit by a sledgehammer wrapped in barbed wire. The force spun me violently away from the panel, throwing me across the floor toward the sealed service corridor. I slammed against the doorframe, tasting blood, my vision swimming. When my eyes cleared enough to focus, the tactical team was no longer interested in me. They had dropped their weapons and were rushing to the containment chamber, their faces contorted in expressions of sheer terror. The figure inside the chamber, the one that had been unconscious moments ago, was now standing, the restraints having snapped under the power surge. It was taller than I expected, unnaturally slender, and it was staring directly at the tactical team with an expression of profound, ancient hunger. The operative leader, recovering fastest, tried to raise his weapon again, but he was too late. The figure inside the chamber didn't use hands or specialized equipment. It simply raised one hand toward the operative, and the air around the man's helmet seemed to shimmer and distort. The operative choked, clawing at his helmet, his body convulsing violently as if suffering an immediate, catastrophic system failure. Then, with a wet, tearing sound, the man collapsed, his tactical suit deflating around a limp, unmoving form. The other two operatives didn't hesitate. They spun around, not toward the threat in the chamber, but toward the nearest blast door, scrambling to seal themselves in. But the entity was faster. It hadn't left the chamber. It pressed its palm against the reinforced glass, and the entire structure groaned under an unseen external pressure. The glass began to crack in intricate spiderweb patterns. I was barely conscious, slumped against the frame of the now open service door, watching this impossible scene unfold. I had unleashed something catastrophic. With a final, sickening thrum, the thick containment glass shattered outward in 1,000 glittering shards. The entity stepped out, pausing for one brief moment to look directly toward me, the source of its freedom, its eyes reflecting the pulsing red of the emergency lights. Then it moved. It didn't walk toward the remaining operatives trying to barricade themselves in the blast door. It moved toward the open, dark abyss of the main elevator shaft, the route I had used to get down. As it reached the edge of the pit, it didn't hesitate. It simply stepped into the void, descending into the darkness with impossible speed, leaving me alone in the flashing red chaos with the two remaining horrified operatives staring at the empty shaft, and the rapidly approaching sound of the lower-level guards finally breaking through the upper containment panels. The silence that followed the entity's descent into the elevator shaft was heavier than the alarms had ever been. The two remaining tactical operatives stood frozen for a beat, their training momentarily overridden by sheer biological terror. They had faced down a corporate security risk. They had not been prepared for something else. The sound of metal tearing from the floor above them, where the guards from the lower levels were finally breaching the upper shaft, provided the necessary shock to break their paralysis. "It's loose! Seal the main exit!" one of them shrieked, abandoning any thought of securing the core systems. They scrambled past me, not even sparing a glance toward the broken body of their leader or the shattered containment unit. They ran toward the heavy blast doors leading to what I assumed was the primary evacuation route, abandoning the facility and whatever sensitive data it held. I pushed myself off the doorframe, ignoring the grinding, tearing pain radiating from my shoulder. My objective had shifted entirely. It was no longer about exposing Thorn. It was about surviving the fallout of what I'd unleashed. If that thing, whatever classified horror Thorn had been guarding, got to the surface, the consequences would be unthinkable. The initial accusation of corporate espionage would turn into something far, far worse, something that involved mass panic and perhaps even the kind of tyajka obvinenia Thorn had once threatened me with, only this time it would be legitimate. I staggered toward the service corridor door, peering through the opening. The 2 remaining operatives were frantically working the manual override wheel on the blast door, their movements jerky and desperate. I didn't have time to fight them. I didn't have the strength or the weapon power. I had to get to the surface, and I had to seal this entire facility shut. I checked the control panel I had shorted out, the one that freed the entity. The display was fried, but the main physical interface where I'd jammed Thorne's dead weapon was still smoking. Perhaps the system was in a total failsafe state. I stumbled back to the elevator shaft opening. The metal grinding from above had stopped, replaced by confused shouts echoing down the now open, sparking shaft. The guards from below were coming up to the main floor, expecting to find Thorne in control. I sprinted to the main elevator platform, which was stuck halfway up. Using the emergency latch controls Thorne had used, I managed to force the platform to descend the final few feet to the underground level, where the air was now thick with the smell of burnt circuits and ozone. The 2 lower-level guards who had broken through were standing in stunned silence where their commander had fallen. They looked up as my battered form emerged from the shaft, seeing the state of the control room, the shattered glass, the smoke, the 2 tactical officers frantically trying to open the main blast door 50 yards away. "Manager David?" one of them stammered, recognizing me instantly. "What happened? Where's Mr. Thorne?" "Thorne is gone. The subject is loose," I choked out, pointing toward the entity's point of exit, the dark, open elevator shaft. "We have to initiate hard lockdown, now, before they get outside." The guards, seeing the undeniable evidence of a catastrophic breach, snapped into action, their focus shifting from Thorne's orders to basic containment protocol. They immediately bypassed the panicking tactical team and ran toward the main server banks, where the facility's core controls would be housed. "Level 4 emergency seal protocol," the lead guard yelled into his headset. "Containment failure in Sector Alpha. Initiating subterranean purge." I didn't argue. I followed them, limping, grabbing a spare radio from the side of a downed tactical operative. We reached the primary control console, a massive, multi-screened workstation designed to manage the entire underground complex. The guards began inputting override codes, their fingers flying across the illuminated keyboards. "David, if this entity reaches the surface, the official explanation will be a ciężkie obwinienie against Apex Logistics for industrial sabotage leading to accidental chemical exposure," the guard explained rapidly, not looking away from the screen. "But if we seal this facility now, the official narrative becomes a containment failure, a contained industrial accident. No one comes looking for survivors." I understood the implication. I was about to become officially deceased in a localized disaster, erasing all evidence of my existence and allowing the service to bury the horror underground. It was the only way out alive with a plausible story. "Do it," I managed, leaning heavily against the cool metal of the console. The guards hit the final sequence. A klaxon blared, a new sound, deeper and more resonant than the earlier alarms, signifying the final, irreversible lockdown. Massive metal bolts began slamming into place across all access points visible on the schematic displays. The lights in the main hangar flickered violently, then stabilized into a sickly, dim amber, minimal power retention. The final action was the most terrifying. The guard slammed his hand on a large, red shielded button labeled Subterranean Atmosphere Stabilization, Containment Mode. A deep, shuddering vibration ran through the entire complex, a sound like the Earth itself taking a massive, final breath. We were being sealed in, entombed, leaving whatever Thorne had unleashed to its fate in the upper levels, or, hopefully, contained by the facility's final automated defenses. "It's done," the guard whispered, collapsing against the console, exhausted. "We're sealed. The air scrubbers are offline for atmospheric stabilization. We have maybe 48 hours before the backup generators kick in, and if that thing is still topside, it won't matter anyway." I stared at the monitor displaying the surface access points. They were all solid red squares. I was alive, technically, buried miles beneath the earth in a tomb of technological secrets, but I was alive. I looked at the radio in my hand, the one I'd taken from the dead operative. It was military grade, independent of the local base frequency. With my good arm, I slowly brought it to my mouth. I had to tell someone, anyone, the truth, even if I was only telling it to the static. "This is David Chen," I whispered into the mic, the sound almost lost in the renewed, low thrum of the facility settling into its grave. "Apex Logistics Facility is compromised. Subject designated entity is loose on the surface, presumed headed toward the Sterling Works vicinity. Request immediate, silent investigation. Do not engage the target directly. Seal the perimeter. I repeat, seal the perimeter. I am initiating self-quarantine below Level 3 access." I paused, listening to the static hiss. No confirmation, no response. Then, just as I was about to click the microphone off, a voice, clear and sharp, cut through the hiss. A voice that was neither Thorne's nor the guard's. A voice with authority that transcended corporate secrecy. "David Chen, we read you loud and clear. Stand by for extraction coordinates. And David, do not, under any circumstances, attempt to leave that bunker. You are now evidence."